Power doesn't make you untouchable, it just reveals who you really are. The soft hum of conversation and the delicate clink of silverware filled the air, wrapping the upscale Manhattan restaurant in a glow of quiet prestige where every glass sparkled and every guest seemed carefully curated, the kind of place where men like Ethan Caldwell didn't just dine, they dominated. When the doors opened, the subtle shift in energy was immediate, like a cold front moving through a warm room. Conversations lowered, eyes dropped, and even the maître d' straightened instinctively. As Ethan stepped inside in a perfectly tailored black suit, his presence sharp, controlled, and undeniably feared, a man known not just for his billions but for the way he wielded them, efficiently, ruthlessly, without apology. Across the room, Grace Miller adjusted the strap of her apron, her fingers brushing against the worn edges of a small name tag tucked inside her pocket, her mother's name etched faintly across its surface, a quiet reminder of something steady in a life that rarely was. She had just finished a double shift the night before and picked up another this morning, her rent overdue, her mother's prescriptions waiting unpaid at a pharmacy 2 blocks away. Every hour mattered, every dollar counted, and yet as she balanced a tray of drinks and moved between tables, she couldn't ignore the tension rippling outward from the man who had just arrived, a young busboy, barely out of high school, approached Ethan's table with careful hands but nervous steps, placing a glass slightly off-center, and that was all it took. Ethan's voice cut through the room, low but sharp, criticizing the placement, the timing, the competence, each word precise and heavy, not loud enough to cause a scene but enough to shrink the boy where he stood, the kind of correction that lingered longer than any mistake ever could. The room froze in that subtle way people do when they pretend not to notice but feel everything. Grace felt it too, the familiar tightening in her chest, the internal warning that told her to stay out of it, to keep her head down, to survive the shift, because people like Ethan Caldwell didn't get challenged, they got avoided, accommodated, obeyed. Her steps slowed, then stopped, the tray in her hand suddenly heavier than it should have been. She watched the boy nod silently, apologizing over, and something inside her refused to settle. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was everything she had swallowed for too long, or maybe it was the quiet voice of her mother echoing somewhere deeper than fear, reminding her that dignity wasn't something you traded, no matter how high the stakes. Grace set the tray down on the nearest table with a soft but deliberate motion, the sound barely noticeable but final in her own mind, and before she could talk herself out of it, she walked forward, each step measured, each breath steady, until she stood just beside the table, the entire room holding its breath in silence. Ethan glanced up, irritation flickering across his expression at the interruption, but before he could speak, Grace met his gaze directly, her voice calm but unwavering. Then maybe you should learn how to speak to people before ordering from them. The words hung there, simple, unpolished, but immovable, and for the first time since he walked in, Ethan Caldwell didn't immediately respond, because no one ever talked to him like that, no one ever refused to step back, and in that single moment, something shifted, not in the room, but in him, something unfamiliar, something that didn't feel like control. The silence that followed did not feel like relief, it felt like the moment before something irreversible, and Grace became aware of every pair of eyes in the room, the quiet judgment, the disbelief, the silent question of why she would risk everything for a stranger, especially when everything she had was already hanging by a thread. Ethan's gaze did not waver, his expression unreadable, not anger, not amusement, something colder, something more analytical, as if he were studying her instead of reacting. And that unsettled her more than any raised voice could have, because she had expected retaliation, not stillness. The busboy stepped back, unsure whether to stay or disappear, and the manager appeared almost instantly, his face pale as he approached, forcing a tight smile that did not reach his eyes. "Sir, I am very sorry, we will handle this immediately." His voice carried a quiet urgency, the kind that came from fear rather than professionalism, and his eyes flicked toward Grace with a warning she understood too well. Grace inhaled slowly, her fingers brushing against the fabric of her apron where the outline of the old name tag rested, grounding her, reminding her that fear did not get to decide who she was, even now. The manager turned sharply to her, his voice lowered but firm. "Grace, step into the back, now." It was not a request, it was damage control, and she knew it, but she also knew that walking away would undo everything she had just stood for. So instead she held her ground for one more second longer than she should have, long enough for Ethan to notice. Then, without another word, she stepped back, not defeated, but contained, picking up her tray and moving toward the kitchen as if nothing had happened, even though everything had. the moment she crossed the swinging doors. The noise rushed back in, but it sounded distant, muffled by the pounding in her ears, the fluorescent lights harsher than before, the air thicker, and before she could set the tray down, the manager was there, his composure gone. "What were you thinking?" he whispered sharply, careful not to be overheard. "Do you have any idea who that is?" Grace swallowed, her throat dry, but her voice did not shake when she answered, "Yes, I do," which only made him more frustrated. "Then you should also know that people like him do not get corrected. Not here, not anywhere." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing once, then stopping in front of her, lowering his voice even more. "You are already behind on your schedule, Grace. You asked for extra shifts, you said you needed this job, and now you are putting it at risk over something that is not your responsibility." The words hit harder because they were true. Every single one of them, and for a brief moment doubt crept in, quiet but persistent, asking if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She looked down at her hands, still steady despite everything, then reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, worn name tag, the metal slightly bent, the engraving faded but still legible. She traced it with her thumb, just once, before slipping it back into place, and when she looked up again, her expression had settled into something firm, something that did not ask for permission. "It became my responsibility the moment no one else said anything," she replied softly, and that was when the manager exhaled. Not in anger, but in resignation, because he knew there was no undoing this now. Out in the dining room, Ethan Caldwell remained seated, but he was no longer eating, his attention fixed not on the menu or his phone, but on the closed kitchen doors, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table as if he were considering something far more complex than a simple complaint, because for the first time in a long time, someone had not adjusted themselves around him, they had stood still, and for reasons he could not immediately explain, that refusal lingered in his mind far more than any flawless service ever could. The rest of the shift moved forward, but not in the way it had before. Every step Grace took felt watched, every order she called out carried an invisible weight, and even though no one said anything directly, the energy in the kitchen had changed, quieter, cautious, as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. She kept her head down, focusing on the rhythm she knew by heart: refill drinks, clear plates, smile when needed, move fast enough to stay invisible but not so fast that she made mistakes. Yet the moment lingered in her mind, replaying in fragments, the look in Ethan's eyes, not anger, not dismissal, something that had unsettled her because it felt like recognition. About 30 minutes later, the manager approached her again, this time slower, less urgent, but no less serious. "He asked for you," he said quietly, and for a brief second, Grace thought she had misheard. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady but lower than usual. "I mean exactly that," he replied, glancing toward the dining room. "He wants you to take his table." The words did not feel like an opportunity. They felt like a test, and both of them knew it. Grace exhaled slowly, wiping her hands on her apron, feeling the outline of the name tag again, a small, familiar reassurance, then nodded once. "Okay," she said, because there was no version of this where she could step back now. When she pushed through the doors into the dining room again, the contrast hit her immediately. The warm lighting, the soft music, the illusion that nothing had happened at all. Except it had, and everyone knew it, even if they pretended not to. Ethan sat exactly where she had left him, posture relaxed, expression composed, but his attention shifted the moment she approached, not with impatience, but with intention, as if this interaction mattered more than the meal itself. Grace stopped beside the table, her tone professional, controlled. "Are you ready to order?" she asked, giving him the same service she would give anyone else, no more, no less. Ethan studied her for a moment before answering, his voice calm, measured. "I was under the impression you were not interested in serving me." It was not a challenge, not exactly, but it was not neutral either, and Grace met it without hesitation. "I am interested in doing my job," she replied. "That does not change depending on who is sitting at the table." The response landed between them, simple, but firm. Ethan leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping once against the edge of the table before going still. "And what about what happened earlier?" he asked, watching her closely, as if waiting for her to retreat, to soften, to apologize. Grace shook her head just slightly, not in defiance, but in clarity. "That also does not change," she said. "You were out of line, and I said something, that is all." There was no edge in her voice, no anger, just truth, and somehow that made it harder to dismiss. A faint shift crossed Ethan's expression, something almost like curiosity, and for the first time, the dynamic between them did not feel like Power versus fear. It felt like something else entirely, something balanced in a way he was not used to. He picked up the menu, glancing at it briefly before setting it back down. Then I suppose I will trust your recommendation, he said, a subtle change in tone that did not go unnoticed, and Grace nodded, offering a suggestion without hesitation, her voice steady, her posture unchanged, as if the man in front of her was not someone who could alter the course of her life with a single decision. As she turned to place the order, she felt it again, that quiet shift in the air, but this time it was different, not tension, not fear, but the beginning of something neither of them had planned, because for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Caldwell was not being accommodated, he was being met, and he did not yet know what to do with that. The plate arrived perfectly composed, every detail aligned with the quiet precision the restaurant was known for, but Ethan barely glanced at it. His attention remained fixed on Grace as she placed it down with steady hands, her movements efficient, unshaken, as if the tension that had filled the room earlier had never existed, yet he knew it had, and more importantly, he knew she had not forgotten it either. Grace stepped back slightly, giving the same respectful distance she offered every guest, her expression neutral, professional, but not distant. There was still something present in her gaze, something grounded, and that unsettled him in a way he could not immediately define. Most people adjusted themselves around him, softened their tone, changed their posture, became more agreeable without even realizing it, but Grace had not shifted, not even a fraction, and that consistency made her impossible to categorize, which, to a man like Ethan Caldwell, felt like a problem that needed solving. He picked up his fork, cutting into the dish without looking down. "Do you always speak to customers that way?" he asked, his voice calm, almost conversational, but layered with intent, and Grace did not hesitate. "Only when they forget they are speaking to people," she replied, her tone even, not confrontational, not apologetic, simply factual. Ethan paused for a fraction of a second, the smallest break in his rhythm, then continued, tasting the food as if the exchange were secondary, but it was not to him. It across the room, a well-dressed couple called for attention, their voices louder than necessary, their tone edged with impatience, the kind that came from expecting immediate service, and Grace glanced in their direction, then back to Ethan. "Excuse me," she said, and stepped away, returning to the flow of the room without waiting for dismissal, and that, too, did not go unnoticed. Ethan watched her navigate the dining floor, not hurried, not flustered, moving with a quiet confidence that did not seek approval. And for reasons he did not yet understand, he found himself paying closer attention than he ever had to anyone in this setting. The couple she approached began complaining about their reservation, their expectations unmet, their tone growing sharper with each sentence, but Grace did not shrink under it. She listened, acknowledged, and responded with calm clarity, offering solutions without surrendering her composure, and within minutes, the tension dissolved, replaced by reluctant acceptance. And as she walked away, the interaction left no residue of conflict behind, only quiet resolution. Ethan set his fork down, his interest no longer hidden behind pretense, because what he was witnessing did not align with the patterns he knew. This was not compliance, it was control of a different kind, one that did not rely on power, and that made it unfamiliar. When Grace returned to his table, he was ready, not with a complaint, but with something else entirely. "You handled that well," he said, not as praise, but as observation, and Grace gave a small nod. "It is part of the job," she replied, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them no longer defined by conflict, but by something quieter, something more deliberate. Ethan reached into his jacket, pulling out his wallet with a motion that was practiced, effortless, and placed a folded stack of bills on the edge of the table, not handed to her, not even acknowledged directly, just left there as if it were an expected conclusion to the interaction, a silent transaction that had ended countless exchanges before. Grace's eyes moved to the money, then back to him, and for a brief second, the room seemed to narrow, the noise fading into the background, because this was the moment that mattered, the moment where expectations would either be met or broken, and without rushing, without hesitation, she reached forward, not to take the money, but to slide it back toward him, her voice steady, unmistakable. "You are paying for the meal, not for what I said." And just like that, the balance shifted again, leaving Ethan Caldwell with something he could not purchase, could not override. And for the first time in a long time, something he could not immediately control. The bills remained untouched between them, a quiet line drawn across the table that neither of them crossed, and for a moment Ethan did not move, his gaze resting on the money as if it no longer belonged to him, as if it had lost its usual certainty, because it always worked, always ended conversations, always simplified people into something predictable, but not this time, not with her. Grace had already stepped back, not waiting for a reaction, not lingering for approval, simply returning to her work as if the moment had already passed, and that absence of expectation unsettled him more than resistance ever could. He slowly reached forward, not to push the money back again, but to fold it once and place it inside his wallet, a small, deliberate action that carried more weight than the gesture itself, and when he looked up again, Grace was already across the room, taking another order, her voice calm, her posture unchanged, as if she had not just refused something most people would have accepted without hesitation. The rest of the meal passed without interruption, but not without awareness. Ethan found himself noticing details he had never paid attention to before, the way Grace checked on a table without hovering, the way she adjusted her tone depending on who she was speaking to without losing herself in the process, the way she moved through pressure without absorbing it, and none of it felt rehearsed, none of it felt transactional. It felt real in a way that made him question something deeper than service. When he finally stood to leave, the manager appeared again, eager, attentive, overly careful, offering apologies that were no longer needed, promising adjustments that had not been requested, but Ethan barely acknowledged him, his attention already elsewhere. As he walked toward the exit, his pace slowed just enough to stop near the service station where Grace was organizing receipts, her focus fixed, her movements efficient, and for a brief second, he simply stood there, not as a customer, not as a man accustomed to being addressed first, but as someone who was not entirely sure how to begin. Grace sensed the presence before she looked up, and when she did, her expression did not shift into anything performative. It remained exactly what it had been from the beginning, steady, present, unafraid. "Is there anything else you need?" she asked, her tone professional, but not distant, and Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary before answering. "No," he said, then paused, as if the word alone was incomplete. "But I will be back." The statement was simple, almost casual, but it carried a certainty that neither of them dismissed. Grace gave a small nod, not questioning it, not reacting to it, simply accepting it as another part of the moment. "Then I will be here," she replied, and there was no promise in her voice, no anticipation, just truth. Ethan inclined his head slightly, a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not by her, and without another word, he turned and walked out of the restaurant, the door closing behind him with a quiet finality that did not feel like an ending, but like the beginning of something unresolved. Outside, the city moved as it always did, indifferent, constant, but Ethan did not immediately step into his waiting car. Instead, he stood there for a moment, his reflection faintly visible in the glass behind him, and for the first time in a long time, the image did not feel entirely familiar, because somewhere between the silence, the refusal, and the absence of fear, something had shifted. Something small but undeniable, and he knew, with a clarity he could not ignore, that he would return, not for the food, not for the service, but for the one person in that room who had not adjusted herself to fit his world, and in doing so, had quietly begun to change it. The next morning arrived quieter than the night before, but for Grace, the weight had not lifted, it had only settled deeper, into the small, practical corners of her life where consequences mattered more than moments. The alarm on her phone buzzed at 6:30, the sound thin and persistent, and she reached over to silence it before it could wake her mother in the next room. The apartment still dim, the early light barely pushing through the blinds, carrying with it the reminder of everything waiting beyond that door. She sat up slowly, her body still carrying the exhaustion of back-to-back shifts, but there was no room to linger, no space to replay what had happened. Not when rent was still due, not when the pharmacy receipt sat folded on the kitchen counter, not when reality had a way of demanding attention louder than any memory ever could. In the kitchen, she poured a cup of coffee that had long since lost its warmth and leaned against the counter for just a second, her fingers brushing the edge of the old name tag resting beside the sink. She had taken it out of her apron the night before without thinking, placing it there like a quiet anchor, and now, in the stillness of the morning, she picked it up again, tracing the faded letters with her thumb, grounding herself in something that did not change, something that did not depend on who walked through a restaurant door. Across the city, Ethan Caldwell's morning looked very different, but felt unexpectedly similar. His penthouse overlooking the skyline, floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting a version of him that was always composed, always in control, yet as he stood there with a cup of black coffee untouched in his hand, his thoughts were not on the market reports waiting on his desk or the meetings scheduled with precision down to the minute. They returned, again and again, to a single moment that had disrupted something he had long considered fixed. His assistant's voice came through the speaker, reminding him of the 9 o'clock board call, the 10:30 investor briefing, the afternoon site visit, each item delivered with efficiency. But Ethan did not respond immediately, his gaze still fixed on the city below as if searching for something within it, something he had not noticed before. "Move the lunch meeting," he said finally, his voice even, controlled, but carrying a quiet decision that did not invite discussion. "Reschedule it for another day." There was a brief pause on the other end, just long enough to register the change. "Of course," she replied, already adjusting his calendar, because that was how his world worked. Flexible where it needed to be, responsive to his direction, always aligning with his priorities. But this time, the shift was not about business, not about strategy. It was about something far less predictable, something that did not fit neatly into numbers or projections. Back at the restaurant, Grace arrived 10 minutes early, the familiar routine offering a sense of control she needed, tying her apron, checking the floor layout, reviewing reservations, each step deliberate, each action grounding her in the present. And for a while, it worked. The rhythm returned, steady, manageable, until the front door opened and the subtle change in the room made itself known again. She did not need to look to know who had walked in. The shift in energy was unmistakable, the quiet awareness, the slight hesitation in movement. But this time, when she did glance up, it was not with surprise, it was with recognition, because he had said he would return, and unlike most promises made in passing, this one had not been empty. Ethan stepped inside with the same composed presence, but something about it felt different, less like a storm entering the room and more like a man choosing to be there. And when his eyes found hers across the distance, the moment held, not with tension, not with defiance, but with something quieter, something deliberate, because whatever had started the night before had not ended, it had only paused, waiting for what came next. The moment Ethan stepped inside, the room adjusted again, but this time Grace did not. She simply finished placing a glass on a nearby table before turning fully toward him, her posture steady, her expression unchanged, as if his presence did not carry the same weight it did for everyone else, and that alone shifted something subtle but undeniable in the air. The host moved quickly, offering the best table, the same one from the night before, and Ethan accepted it without hesitation, his gaze never quite leaving Grace as she approached, not rushed, not delayed, simply on her own terms. And when she reached the table, she did not wait for him to speak first. "Good afternoon," she said, her tone calm, grounded. "Would you like the same table service as yesterday?" The question was routine, but the delivery was not. It carried a quiet awareness, a recognition of continuity without assumption. Ethan nodded once, taking his seat. "I would," he replied, his voice measured, but there was something beneath it now, something less guarded, as if he were no longer trying to control the direction of the exchange, only observe where it might lead. Grace placed a glass of water in front of him, the movement precise, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence no longer uncomfortable, but deliberate, until Ethan broke it, not with a command, but with a question that seemed almost out of place in his world. "Do you always remember your customers?" he asked, and Grace met his gaze without hesitation. "Only the ones who give me a reason to," she answered, and the corner of his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but something close enough to be noticed. Across the room, a new server struggled with a large tray, her hands unsteady, her steps uncertain, and Grace's attention flickered briefly in that direction before returning to Ethan. But he had already seen it, already understood the instinct behind it, and this time, he acted before she could, raising his hand slightly to signal the manager, who appeared almost instantly. "Have someone assist her," Ethan said quietly, his tone not sharp, not critical, just clear, and the manager nodded, moving quickly to correct the situation without creating tension. Grace watched the interaction for a second longer than necessary, then looked back at him, something shifting behind her steady expression, something that had not been there the day before, not trust, not yet, but acknowledgement, and Ethan noticed it immediately. "That was different," she said, not accusing, not praising, just stating what was, and Ethan leaned back slightly, his fingers resting loosely against the table. "So was yesterday," he replied, and for the first time, there was no distance in the statement, no separation between cause and effect, only a quiet recognition that something had already begun to change. Grace nodded once, accepting the answer without pressing further, because Whatever this was, it was not something that needed to be forced, and as she took his order, the exchange moved forward with a rhythm that no longer felt like a test, but like a conversation slowly finding its footing. Throughout the afternoon, Ethan remained longer than necessary, not because the meal required it, but because he was observing, not just Grace, but everything around her, the way she moved through pressure, the way she held her ground without confrontation, the way she created space for others without diminishing herself, and each detail added to something he could not easily define, something that did not fit into the structures he had built his life around. When Grace returned with the check, placing it neatly at the edge of the table, Ethan did not reach for his wallet immediately. Instead, he looked up at her, his voice quieter than before. "You said yesterday that power does not give someone the right to humiliate others," he began, and Grace held his gaze. Waiting, not interrupting. "What does it give them?" he finished, the question simple, but carrying a weight that had nothing to do with money or authority, and everything to do with something he had not questioned in a very long time. Grace did not answer right away, her eyes steady, thoughtful, as if choosing her words carefully, not to impress, not to challenge, but to be honest. "It gives them a choice," she said finally, "to make things better, or to prove they never understood what power was in the first place." The word settled between them, quiet but lasting, and for the first time, Ethan Caldwell did not have an immediate response, because for once, the answer was not something he could control, only something he had to face. The question did not end when the check was paid. It followed Ethan long after he stepped out of the restaurant and into the quiet hum of the city, settling into the spaces between his thoughts where decisions were usually immediate and certain, but now felt delayed, unsettled, as if something had interrupted the pattern he had relied on for years. That evening, the boardroom on the 42nd floor of his headquarters was exactly as it had always been: polished glass, controlled lighting, a table long enough to separate influence from hesitation, and yet the atmosphere shifted the moment the meeting began, not because the numbers were different, but because Ethan was a senior executive presented a report on labor cost reductions, outlining strategies with precise confidence, suggesting tighter schedules, fewer breaks, efficiency measures that looked clean on paper but carried weight in ways that were never written down, and under normal circumstances, Ethan would have approved. Without pause, the logic clear, the outcome profitable, the decision simple. But this time, he did not speak immediately, his gaze fixed not on the projection screen, but on the reflection of it in the glass wall behind it, the image slightly distorted, just enough to disrupt the clarity he was used to, and for a moment, he saw not the numbers, but the people behind them, the servers moving quickly through crowded floors, the quiet pressure of staying composed under constant demand, the cost that never appeared in reports. "What happens to the staff?" he asked finally, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that shifted the room. The executive paused, slightly caught off guard. "We maintain minimum coverage," he replied, adjusting his tone. "It is within acceptable standards," and Ethan nodded once, but did not look satisfied. "Acceptable to who?" he asked, not raising his voice, but narrowing the focus of the conversation in a way that made the room quieter than any authority ever had. There was no immediate answer, not a real one. And for the first time in that space, efficiency did not feel like the only priority. Across the city, Grace ended her shift later than planned, the day longer than usual, but not because of the work itself, rather because of the subtle awareness that had followed her since Ethan's return. Not pressure, not expectation, but something that required her attention in a different way, something she could not ignore but also could not define. She stepped out into the evening air, the temperature dropping just enough to remind her she had forgotten her jacket. And as she walked toward the bus stop, the city felt quieter than usual, or maybe she was just more aware of it, her thoughts circling back to the conversation they had shared, the question he had asked, and the way he had listened, not to respond, but to understand, and that difference stayed with her longer than she expected. The next afternoon, the restaurant buzzed with a different kind of energy, not tense, but anticipatory. Word had spread that something was changing at the corporate level, small adjustments already being discussed, schedules being reviewed, management more attentive than before, and no one could quite explain why, only that it seemed to have started suddenly, without announcement, without explanation. When Ethan walked in again, the shift was noticeable, not in his presence, but in the way people responded to it. Less fear, more curiosity, and when Grace met his gaze from across the room, there was something new there, not distance, not defiance, but recognition of a change that had not been spoken aloud, only acted upon. He took his seat, and this time, when Grace approached, There was no need for tension, no need for testing, only the quiet continuation of something that had already begun to reshape both of their worlds in ways neither of them had fully understood yet, because sometimes the most significant changes did not start with grand gestures, but with a single moment where someone chose not to step back, and another chose, for the first time, to step forward differently. The changes did not arrive with announcements or headlines, they unfolded quietly, in schedules that felt more humane, in breaks that were no longer rushed, in managers who listened before reacting, and for most people, it felt like a shift they had hoped for but never expected, something rare enough to question, yet real enough to trust. Grace noticed it not through policy, but through people, the new server who no longer trembled when carrying a full tray, the busboy who moved with a little more confidence, the subtle ease that replaced the constant pressure she had grown used to, and while no one said it directly, the source of that change was not difficult to recognize. A week later, the restaurant hosted a private corporate event, the kind that required precision, discretion, and absolute composure, and when Grace checked the reservation list at the start of her shift, she saw his name again, not as a single guest this time, but as the host, and something in her chest tightened just slightly, not with fear, but with awareness that this moment would be different. The room filled gradually, executives in tailored suits, conversations measured and strategic, the kind of environment where status carried weight without being spoken, and yet when Ethan entered, the attention he drew was not the same as before. It was not fear that followed him, but something closer to respect, earned not by distance, but by change. Grace moved through the room with her usual rhythm, focused, steady, until their paths crossed again near the center of the floor, and for a brief second, everything else faded into the background, not because of tension, but because of clarity. Ethan looked at her, not as a customer, not as a man expecting service, but as someone acknowledging a presence that had altered his direction. "I have been meaning to speak with you," he said, his voice low enough to remain between them, and Grace held his gaze, not stepping closer, not stepping back, simply meeting him where he stood. "Then you should," she replied, and there was no hesitation in it. He gestured slightly toward a quieter corner of the room, not as a command, but as an invitation, and after a brief pause, she followed, the space between them carrying a different kind of weight now, not defined by hierarchy, but by something more balanced. "What you said," he began, his tone measured, but without the edge it once carried, about power being a choice. "I did not agree with it at first," he admitted, and Grace listened without interruption, her posture relaxed, her expression open but steady. "But I could not ignore it either," he continued, "so I tested it, not you, myself." The honesty in his words did not feel rehearsed, it felt deliberate, earned, and for the first time, Grace saw not the distance he had created, but the effort it took to step beyond it. She nodded once, acknowledging the truth of it, without praise, because that was not what this was about, and Ethan seemed to understand that, because he did not wait for approval. He simply continued. "There is something I want to offer you," he said, and the sentence could have carried 100 different meanings, most of them predictable, but this one did not follow the same path. "Not money, not a position you have not asked for," he clarified, "but a role in shaping what comes next, a way to make sure the changes do not stop with me." And for a moment, the offer settled between them, not as an opportunity to escape, but as a responsibility to influence. Grace considered it, not with urgency, not with doubt, but with the same clarity she had carried from the beginning. "I am not interested in being a symbol," she said, her voice calm. "If I do this, it is because it matters, not because it looks good." And Ethan's response was immediate, not defensive, not persuasive, just certain. "That is exactly why I am asking you," and something in the simplicity of that answer made it real. The event continued around them, voices rising and falling, glasses clinking, the world moving forward as it always did, but in that quiet space, something had reached its resolution, not as an ending, but as a beginning shaped by choice rather than circumstance. And when Grace finally nodded, accepting not the man he had been, but the one he was choosing to become, the distance that had once defined them no longer felt like a barrier, but like something they had both crossed, not by force, not by chance, but by understanding. And in that understanding, something stronger than status had taken root, something neither of them could buy, only build.